The morning started like any other Tuesday when Marcus Reynolds returned home from his overnight shift at the hospital. As an ER nurse, he was used to exhaustion, used to the bone-deep weariness that came from 12 hours of trauma cases, cardiac arrests, and the constant adrenaline that never quite left the system even after he clocked out. But nothing, absolutely nothing in his years of medical training could have prepared him for what awaited him in his driveway that morning. His sleek black sedan, the 2022 Honda Accord he'd saved for 3 years to buy, was gone, vanished. In its place sat a bright orange parking violation sticker plastered across his garage door, along with a formal notice from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. The document was typed in aggressive bold letters, the kind that screamed legal authority, even though it was printed on regular office paper. Marcus stood there on his front walkway, travel mug of coffee still in hand, his scrubs wrinkled and smelling faintly of antiseptic, trying to process the words he was reading. The notice claimed his vehicle had been sitting unmoved for over 60 days, which was supposedly irrefutable evidence of abandonment under Section 12.4 of the HOA bylaws. The fine was $800, plus towing and storage fees that were accumulating at a rate of $75 per day. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical blow. He drove that car every single day to work. Every single day. He'd literally just parked it in his driveway the night before at 11:30 p.m. when he'd gotten home from his shift. He'd locked it, set the alarm, and trudged inside to collapse into bed for a few hours before needing to handle errands today. Someone had made a catastrophic error, and Marcus had a sinking, nauseating feeling about exactly who that someone might be. Entered Deborah Patterson, the HOA president who had made it her personal mission to rule the Meadowbrook Heights neighborhood with an iron fist, a laminated copy of every bylaw ever written, and a completely unwarranted sense of authority that would make a military general blush. She was 56 years old, recently retired from a middle management position at an insurance company, and she had devoted every waking hour since her retirement to making the lives of her neighbors absolutely miserable. Deborah was the kind of person who measured grass height with an actual ruler, the kind who reported Christmas decorations left up past January 2nd, the kind who had once called a special HOA meeting to discuss whether beige was an acceptable mailbox color or if it needed to be specifically listed as approved beige versus unapproved beige. Marcus had only lived in the community for 6 months, but he'd already had 3 increasingly ridiculous run-ins with Deborah. First, she'd cited him for parking his car facing the wrong direction in his own driveway, claiming it was an eyesore to the neighborhood aesthetic. Then she complained about his trash cans being visible from the street for approximately 45 minutes past the designated collection time, never mind that the garbage truck had been running late. Most recently, she'd sent him a formal warning about his front door wreath being 2 inches larger than the maximum allowable diameter for door decorations. But this was a whole new level of insanity. Marcus immediately called the towing company listed on the notice. The board dispatcher confirmed that yes, his vehicle was in their impound lot, and yes, the fees were already at $225 for 3 days of storage. 3 days. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising as he explained that he'd parked the car less than 12 hours ago. The dispatcher sighed, clearly having heard this story before. She explained that the HOA had reported the vehicle as abandoned 3 days ago, and they'd been authorized to tow it. If he wanted to dispute it, he'd need to take it up with the HOA. They were just following orders. Marcus hung up and immediately dialed Deborah's number, which was listed on the HOA notice. She answered on the first ring, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The conversation that followed would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. Deborah insisted that she had personally documented his vehicle as abandoned after conducting a thorough investigation. She claimed she placed a marker on his car 60 days ago, a small piece of tape that would have broken or moved if the vehicle had been driven, and it had remained undisturbed all this time. Marcus tried to explain that this was impossible. He drove the car daily. He had gas receipts. He had the parking validation from the hospital garage on days when the staff lot was full. He had GPS data from his phone, showing his regular commute. Deborah's voice turned cold. She informed him that the HOA had photographic evidence, witness statements, and detailed logs. His vehicle was a clear violation, and as a deployed military member, he should have made arrangements for his abandoned property before leaving for service. Marcus stopped mid-sentence. Deployed military member? What on earth was she talking about? Deborah continued, her tone becoming more self-righteous by the second. She explained that she'd done her research. She'd noticed the military-style haircut, the disciplined routine, the early morning departures and late-night returns. She'd seen the duffel bag he occasionally carried. It was obvious to anyone with eyes that he was military, and clearly, he'd been deployed and had failed to properly secure his vehicle before shipping out. The pieces started falling into place in Marcus's mind, and the picture they formed was both hilarious and horrifying. This woman had constructed an entire false narrative based on absolutely nothing. His short haircut was because he preferred low maintenance. His duffel bag was his gym bag. His irregular hours were because he worked rotating shifts at the hospital. He tried to explain this to Deborah. He told her he was a nurse, not a soldier. He told her he'd never been in the military, never been deployed, and had in fact been parking in his own driveway and driving to work every single day for the past 6 months. Deborah's response was swift and condescending. She informed him that lying to HOA officials was a serious violation that could result in additional fines. She'd done her due diligence. She consulted with other board members, and they'd all agreed on the facts. His car was abandoned. The towing was justified, and he owed the HOA $800 plus whatever the impound fees accumulated to. Furthermore, she added with barely concealed satisfaction, if he continued to contest this obvious violation, she would have no choice but pursue legal action and place a lien on his property. Marcus hung up the phone, his hands shaking with anger and disbelief. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was deliberate harassment based on assumptions and stereotypes. Deborah had decided he was military, had decided he was deployed, and had twisted reality to fit her narrative. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. Marcus spent the next hour gathering documentation. He pulled his work schedule, showing every shift he'd worked for the past 6 months. He printed out his time cards. He gathered parking receipts from the hospital. He even pulled the GPS location data from his phone, showing his daily commute from Meadowbrook Heights to St. Catherine's Hospital and back. But he knew this wouldn't be enough for someone like Deborah. She'd already shown she was willing to ignore reality in favor of her own conclusions. He needed something more official, more authoritative. That's when Marcus remembered his neighbor, David Chun, who lived 2 houses down. David was a retired police officer who still maintained connections with the local police department. They chatted a few times over the fence, friendly conversations about neighborhood issues and the increasingly bizarre HOA restrictions. Marcus walked over to David's house and explained the situation. David's expression shifted from confusion to anger to barely suppressed laughter as the story unfolded. David agreed immediately to help. He suggested filing a police report for the wrongful towing, which would create an official record of the incident. He also offered to reach out to some friends still on the force who might be interested in this case, especially given that false claims about military deployment could potentially involve violations of laws protecting service members. That afternoon, officers Jennifer Martinez and Tom Brennan arrived at Marcus's house to take his statement. They were professional, thorough, and increasingly disturbed as Marcus laid out the evidence. The timeline made it clear that the car had been towed while Marcus was at work, hours after he'd parked it. Officer Martinez asked to see the HOA notice. As she read through Deborah's claims about military deployment and abandoned vehicles, her expression hardened. She explained that making false claims about someone's military status, especially to justify punitive action, was potentially illegal under the Stolen Valor Act and various tenant protection laws. Officer Brennan added that the HOA might also be liable for the wrongful towing, illegal seizure of property, and harassment. He suggested they pay a visit to Deborah Patterson to get her side of the story officially documented. The scene at Deborah's house was something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. When she opened the door and saw 2 police officers flanking Marcus, her expression cycled through confusion, annoyance, and then a smug confidence that suggested she thought they were there to support her actions. Officer Martinez asked if they could discuss the vehicle towing incident. Deborah invited them in. Her living room was shrined to HOA documentation with color-coded filing cabinets and a corkboard covered in neighborhood violation photos. She presented her evidence with the confidence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. She had photos of Marcus's car in the driveway, taken from various dates. She had a log where she documented her observations. She had the testimony of another board member, a woman named Patricia, who apparently spent her afternoons watching the street through binoculars for violations. The problem was, her evidence proved the exact opposite of her claims. Officer Brennan pointed this out with barely concealed amusement. The photos were time-stamped, and they showed the car in slightly different positions over the weeks. In some photos, it was pulled further into the driveway. In others, it was angled slightly differently. The concrete beneath the tires showed different patterns of tire marks. There was even one photo where the car was clearly covered in fresh raindrops while the surrounding driveway was dry, indicating it had just been driven in a recent rain. Deborah's face began to redden as she realized her own evidence was betraying her. Officer Martinez asked about the tape marker Deborah claimed to have placed on the vehicle. Where exactly had she placed it? What date? Did she have photos of this marker? Deborah stumbled through an explanation. She'd placed it on the driver's side mirror, she thought, or maybe it was the door handle. She hadn't photographed it because that wasn't necessary. The point was, the car hadn't moved. Marcus interjected. He explained that he washed his car every 2 weeks at the local car wash. He had receipts for this. Any tape would have been removed during the automated wash cycle. Officer Brennan then addressed the elephant in the room. He asked Deborah directly what evidence she had that Marcus was military and currently deployed. This was when Deborah's entire house of cards collapsed. She had no evidence. She'd assumed based on his appearance. She'd assumed based on his schedule. She'd assumed based on what she thought was military-style discipline in his lawn maintenance. Officer Martinez's voice took on a sharp edge. She explained that making false claims about someone's military service was serious. Using those false claims to justify taking legal action against them was even more serious. The HOA had essentially stolen Marcus's property based on a complete fabrication. Deborah tried to backtrack. She insisted it was an honest mistake. She was just trying to maintain community standards. The bylaws gave her authority to address abandoned vehicles. She'd had the community's best interests at heart. Officer Brennan cut through the excuses. He informed her that Marcus had the right to pursue charges for wrongful towing, theft, harassment, and potentially filing a false police report if she claimed military deployment in any official capacity. The police department would be documenting this incident thoroughly. Furthermore, Officer Martinez added, they'd be recommending that the city attorney review the HOA's practices. This kind of overreach and harassment wasn't just a civil matter between neighbors. It was potentially criminal. The color drained from Deborah's face. She looked at Marcus with something between desperation and fury. She tried to appeal to him directly, suggesting that perhaps they could work this out privately, that surely he didn't want to make a big deal out of a simple misunderstanding. Marcus looked at this woman who had made his life miserable for 6 months over the pettiest possible violations, who had just cost him hundreds of dollars and a day of chaos based on completely made-up facts. And he felt a calm settle over him. He explained, in a measured tone he used with difficult patients in the ER, that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was targeted harassment. Deborah had decided she didn't like him, had constructed a false narrative to justify punitive action, and had abused her position in the HOA to cause him tangible harm. He wanted a full refund of all fines and fees. He wanted a written apology. He wanted Deborah to resign from the HOA board. And he wanted a formal review of the HOA's enforcement practices to ensure this never happened to another resident. Deborah sputtered protests. The other board members would never agree to this. She'd been elected by the community. She had every right to enforce the bylaws. Officer Martinez closed her notepad with a decisive snap. She informed Deborah that these were Marcus's very reasonable demands given the circumstances. The alternative was criminal charges, a civil lawsuit, and a very thorough investigation into every HOA action Deborah had taken during her tenure. She suggested Deborah consult with an attorney and with her insurance company as soon as possible. The following week was a whirlwind of activity in Meadowbrook Heights. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about the incident. It turned out Marcus wasn't the only resident who'd been targeted by Deborah's overzealous enforcement. a retired teacher named Helen, had been fined for having solar panels that were supposedly the wrong shade of black. A young couple had been threatened with legal action over their vegetable garden. An elderly man had been cited for his car leaking a single drop of oil in his own driveway. A coalition of fed-up neighbors formed quickly. They demanded a special HOA meeting to address Deborah's conduct and to review the board's practices. The meeting, held in the community center on a Thursday evening, was packed beyond capacity. Deborah attempted to maintain control, but her authority had evaporated. Neighbor after neighbor stood up to share their stories of harassment, excessive fines, and Deborah's apparent vendetta against anyone who didn't conform to her exact vision of suburban perfection. The attorney representing Marcus attended the meeting and laid out the legal liabilities the HOA faced if Deborah remained in her position. The insurance representative for the HOA's liability policy made it clear that continued employment of Deborah could result in dropped coverage. By the end of the evening, Deborah Patterson had resigned from the HOA board. The remaining board members voted to refund Marcus all fees and fines. They also voted to implement new oversight procedures, including requiring board approval for any towing actions and establishing an appeals process for alleged violations. Marcus got his car back, along with a check covering all his expenses and compensating him for his time and distress. The towing company, eager to avoid being implicated in the wrongful seizure, waived all their fees as well. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later. Marcus was washing his car in his driveway on a Saturday morning when he noticed someone watching from the sidewalk. It was Deborah walking her small dog past his house. She looked diminished somehow, smaller without her HOA president badge and clipboard. For a moment, their eyes met. Marcus could see she wanted to say something, perhaps to justify herself one more time or to play the victim. Instead, Marcus simply nodded politely and went back to washing his car, parked boldly in the center of his driveway, facing whatever direction he pleased. The neighborhood of Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal, though it was a different kind of normal. Residents felt more comfortable expressing their individuality. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvement rather than nitpicking enforcement. Several neighbors told Marcus they were grateful he'd stood up to Deborah's tyranny. David Chun, the retired police officer, joked that Marcus had done more for neighborhood peace than the police department had managed in years. The two became good friends, often sitting on David's porch in the evenings, sharing stories and laughing about the absurdity of HOA politics. Marcus learned that Deborah had moved out of Meadowbrook Heights 3 months after the incident, selling her house and relocating to a different state. Rumor had it she joined another HOA board in her new community, but someone had already started a support group for her new neighbors. The black Honda Accord sat proudly in Marcus's driveway, driven daily to the hospital where Marcus continued saving lives with the same dedication he'd shown in defending his rights. Sometimes, when he was pulling in after a long shift, he'd glance at the spot where that orange violation sticker had been plastered and smile. He'd learned an important lesson through all of this. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in emergency rooms or courtrooms or battlefields. Sometimes they're fought in suburban driveways over parking violations and the principle that nobody should have to justify their existence to a tyrant with a laminated rule book and too much time on her hands. And sometimes Marcus thought as he locked his car and headed inside, the sweetest victory is simply living your life on your own terms, parking wherever you want, and knowing that the Karens of the world don't get to write your story. The driveway remained occupied by his car, driven daily, moved constantly, and absolutely, definitively not abandoned. Just like Marcus himself, exactly where he belonged, living proof that false narratives and petty tyranny could be defeated with truth, documentation, and a couple of police officers willing to expose a HOA Karen's lies for exactly what they were, a house of cards built on assumptions, destroyed by facts.